In 2005, a massive expansion of the Metro Gold Line was underway in LA's East Side neighborhood of Boyle Heights. When construction neared the walls of Evergreen Cemetery, an unexpected discovery was made. Human remains of 174 individuals were uncovered where they weren't supposed to be. Analysis of the remains and artifacts determined that most were Chinese males buried a century or more earlier in a long-forgotten cemetery. What the MTA had unearthed that day was a reminder of a dark chapter in Los Angeles' past. In the first part of our exploration of Evergreen Cemetery, we met heroes of the battlefield. In the second, we glimpsed into the lives of LA's foremost pioneers. And now as we take our third and final walk together in this amazing place, we will meet people whose names do not grace street signs or schools, but whose sacrifices were just as important in making LA the modern metropolis that it has become. Come walk with me and pay respects to the city's forgotten souls. They crossed the sea to come to Los Angeles for the same reasons as everybody else did, to make a new life, and to build a future in a land of limitless possibilities. They farmed the fields and built the railroads that brought even more people into this growing city. And they did it all for wages that was barely enough to live on. In the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants lived under some of the harshest forms of discrimination. They were subjected to violence, for which there was no justice. Laws were written that basically made it illegal to be Chinese. They couldn't marry or own land, and voting was out of the question. And when they died, they weren't permitted to bury their dead in the same ground as whites. When Evergreen was established, a deal was made that set aside 5 acres for the city to use as a pauper's field. Only here were Chinese allowed to be buried. However, they were charged $10 per grave, which is equivalent to about $300 today. In comparison, indigent whites were buried there for free. Over the years, periodic mention of Chinese funerals with their Eastern customs would appear as curiosities in the LA newspapers. The Chinese cemetery lasted until the 1920s, when, as one member of the community recalled, her family came one day to find that their ancestor's grave, in fact all the graves were gone. They had simply and without any warning been paved over. And with that final insult, it seemed that the last thread to the past had been cut. After a half-decade of analysis, the bones and artifacts unearthed by the MTA were returned to Evergreen Cemetery for reburial. They were placed near the old ceremonial shrine built in 1888 that somehow defied the bulldozer's wrath. Today, the nameless graves are marked with remembrances and prayers. Furthermore, they have come to represent people of all ethnicities who were laid to rest in LA's Potter's Field. A memorial wall was built to ensure that their sacrifices would never again be forgotten. No matter where you stand in Evergreen, the shimmering towers of LA are in view. And if you look to the northwest on a clear day, you might be able to make out the letters of the Hollywood sign that seem to dance in the ribbons of hot air. And that brings us to a place in the cemetery known as the Showman's Rest. Established in 1922 by the Pacific Coast Showmen's Association, an organization that aids out-of-work and retired circus and carnival personnel. They also provide a place of burial to those who need it. The stone lion atop the memorial keeps a close watch over some 400 graves. In a section of the cemetery near the corner of Evergreen and Cesar Chavez Boulevard is another memorial of sorts. There are no statues or plaques to mark the spot, but to stand here is to know you are someplace special. The closely spaced graves surround you and are a visceral reminder of a troubled time that as a society Americans are still grappling with. To some, segregation is an abstract term associated with a different place and a different time, far distant from sunny Los Angeles. But these graves are evidence that it existed here too, and not so long ago. It is a far section of the cemetery that was the only place African Americans were permitted to be buried. There is a different feeling here over anywhere else in the cemetery. Looking out from many of the headstones are the faces of the departed. Their expressions do not accuse, nor do they betray any of the hardships they faced in life. We are seeing them at their best, the way they wanted to be seen, and the way they wanted to be remembered. It is like looking through an old family album at people whose relationships to us are forgotten, but are nonetheless important. Although segregation no longer exists in American society, it does exist in many minds. There is still so much work that needs to be done before we can achieve a better understanding of one another, and a good place to begin to realize that we are all just faces in the same family album is right here near the corner of Evergreen and Cesar Chavez Boulevard. When I took my first walk through Evergreen, I found a dry brown landscape locked in perpetual autumn. The stillness about the place was broken by an occasional summer breeze that stirred the bare tree limbs. The legions of headstones stood like forlorn sentinels in this city of the dead that is untroubled by the constant rush of traffic just beyond its walls. The monuments of LA's pioneering giants, soaring beyond all human proportion, so thoroughly drew me in that I hardly noticed anything else. In fact, it wasn't until I neared the end of my walk that I broke my skyward gaze and discovered some of the most poignant reminders of the people who once lived in this amazing city. To complete this three-part series, it was necessary to make repeat visits over the span of a few months. Within that time, a record amount of rain fell in California that brought the state out of an epic drought and transformed the parched cemetery, so that for the first time in a long while, Evergreen can live up to its name. But surely as ashes return to ashes and dust returns to dust, the summer sun will once again bake the ground into sepia hues. The only constants here are the graves. The oldest of these were placed without any sense of order, almost like they marked the site of an old battle where the dead were buried exactly where they fell. Many of these graves reach all the way back to Evergreen's beginnings in the 1870s and belong to some of the first settlers to arrive after California statehood. Before completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, the West Coast seemed as distant as the far side of the moon. But once regular rail service was established, a journey that once took up to 6 months could be completed in a week. Most people came to start a new life, but there was another group of people who came for another reason. Throughout the 19th century, the number one cause of death was tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called, and sufferers believed that the warm, temperate climate of Southern California would ease or even cure the dreaded disease. Many of them in the end stages fell prey to quack doctors and their useless remedies. This sad fact came to mind while I was researching for this video. Each name I examined turned into one dead end after another. At best, I could only find scraps of information. Surely they weren't all victims of tuberculosis, but for some unknown reason, their time in the city was so brief as to not be noted on a census or even warrant an obituary in the newspaper. In a few cases, Evergreen did allow me to glimpse into some lives. Like Martin Holman, a druggist who came from Mississippi and owned the Central Pharmacy in Long Beach. Perfumery and prescriptions were his specialty. And there was Massachusetts-born John Innes, who up until a few years before his death in 1892 was a firefighter in the first Pioneer Hose Company of Tucson, Arizona. Also a member of the International Order of Foresters, his headstone displays a symbol of his former career. Francis Quinn, a mechanic from Washougal, Washington, came to Los Angeles to drive in the Pacific Southwest Championship that were said to be some of the most grueling auto races in the country. The league was popularized in the film The Crowd Roars, starring James Cagney and Joan Blondell. Quinn's driving skills were featured in the movie's racing scenes.
How bad the other drivers are, it's always the same. I get started and drive a couple of good laps, and then it happens every time I ever get behind a wheel.
Most of his racing was done out west, but he did make an appearance at the Indy 500 in 1931. However, he was sidelined when his car broke an axle. Undoubtedly, he would have had other chances if fate hadn't stepped in. In December 1931, he was on his way to face rival Ernie Triplett at Oakland Speedway, but the race was called off due to bad weather. On the way home, just outside of Fresno, a truck veered into the path of the tow vehicle Quinn was driving and struck it head-on. He was killed on impact. Francis Quinn's life and career ended prematurely at the age of 28. The pain of loss is magnified when it's a life cut short, like Second Lieutenant Leo Cereza. Leo was bright beyond his years and meant for great things. He graduated Huntington Park High School in 1941 at the age of 16. Then he attended junior college in San Bernardino, where he also played football. In 1943, with World War II in full swing, he joined the Army Air Corps and went into pilot training. A year later, he was at the controls of a P-47 Thunderbolt at Abilene Army Air Base in Texas when his airplane crashed, taking his life shortly before his 20th birthday. But the graves that are the most heart-rending of all are those of children. Each one, and there are many, is a broken dream, a blank page where the story of a life was supposed to be written. Throughout its existence, the rugged acres of Evergreen Cemetery was the stage upon which countless human dramas played out their final act. There is history here, or perhaps a better word is memory. The memories of the quick and the dead are carried on the wind and whisper in the ears of whoever is willing to listen. And if you can hear them, then perhaps you can see them standing amongst the headstones, or in the shadows of the trees. They are the forgotten faces in our family album. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe to my channel today for more grave explorations.